And thank you all very much for coming. It's a great pleasure to have you here. I want to welcome our visitors to the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. I especially want to note thanks to Hugh Montgomery, who on his day that he is retiring, he found time to attend here. And to those on the webcast, and I want to especially say hello to my friend Todd Levitt. I know he's on there. My co-presenter here is Faith MacDonald, the research assistant here at Potomac Institute, who assisted me mightily with the research for this talk. So Faith, thank you very much. We're here to talk about game changers in defense technology. And there's actually a history behind this topic and a paper that is in preparation based on this topic. It was tasking from the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics to the Director of Defense Research and Engineering, now called the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And in fact, I have good reason to believe that the tasking actually derived from the new Secretary of Defense, who in his confirmation hearings was basically asked, well, what about science and technology? And his answer was, if confirmed, I will do a review and find out what are the important topics. So when confirmed and when in office, he asked the Undersecretary about, well, what about science and technology? And the Undersecretary asked the Assistant Secretary this question: what are, in the next 5-6 years, what are the 5 or 6 or whatever big technology topics that will make a difference in U.S. defense capabilities over the next 10, 20 years? The question sort of logically leads to a follow-up question, which is not the topic of today's talk, and I'm not really prepared to pursue. But it's a logical thing to ask is, well, what were the game-changing technologies over the past, if you look back 10, 20 years? And you know, you quickly can think of some major new capabilities that have come into vogue or been utilized, but technologies and capabilities are different things, and that really is going to be the theme of the talk. So, yes.
Are you taking questions during?
Yes, this is very much intended to be a global discussion.
So my question is, game changers seem like you're looking at positive game changers, but there's things that have happened in the past 10 or 20 years that have hurt us horribly, like cyber viruses and bots and things like that. Those weren't around 30, 25 years ago. And I wouldn't call any of those things cyber menaces. And they changed our game.
So the tasking you see specifically mentions gave most advantage to
being
the US.
able to defeat.
That's right. A positive. So the question is positive game changers, but your point's an excellent one. That in the analysis process and in our developments of technologies, one wants to ask the question how to use these technologies for good and not bad. And a continual theme, both in the commercial marketplace, but one we need to take into account in defense technologies, is that those who arrive first at a new technology oftentimes are the first to adopt and to create, and they get the advantage. Just ask companies like Apple. It's not that their technology is necessarily so unique, but they're the first to develop, to deliver.
I'd like to expand this by just a sliver.
Excellent.
And by using examples of IEDs,
right,
which are low-tech. They have, I mean, not terribly low, but not very high. Not by the standards that we are focusing on the way you see nothing wrong with your choice here, I mean, by all means. But I really like this question. It's a big window that the author looks through.
Yeah. I guess my concern, not so much with the question, but with the thought pattern, is if you say, if that leads to, well, we should throttle back and not develop that technology because it could be of detriment to us or to our position, then you run the risk of allowing somebody else to develop that technology first and being less able to control the capabilities that come into play. So one of the things that the Honorable Zach Limnios, who received this tasking, said to me was that he thought that the process of answering this question was as important as the answer. I don't know if I should publicly say whether or not I agree or disagree with that, but I was willing to pursue a process which is outlined here. We sort of agreed that you begin by understanding the future environment. And that leads to some speculation, some analyses, some thoughts on what potential future national security challenges should look like. That leads to thoughts about what sort of capabilities would give you a decisive advantage in those situations. And then you start asking, well, what sort of technologies should we pursue? So the hypothesis is that this process is a valuable and useful one. And by the way, it sort of mimics, but specific to science and technology, but it sort of mimics the quadrennial defense review kind of process, where every 4 years the department says, well, what's our operating environment look like now? What do we expect to look like over the next few years? So what should we be doing? Jerry.
So this thought process steps away from the potential of the technology or some technology actually driving the future operating environment.
So it's a very astute observation. And in fact, what did the Assistant Secretary do but ask his entire staff, well, what do you think are the game-changing technologies? And so they jumped right to the end, exactly as you're suggesting, and started listing technologies. And I'm told, I wasn't particularly there, but I'm told that this generated a great deal of discussion among various groups, both within and outside of the Department of Defense, as to what they thought were sort of the most important things. People, I guess, were worried that if they didn't get it on the list, then in budget cuts are coming, their technology or their idea might suffer cuts or lower priority. What's interesting about, and I synopsized a number of these different lists, and here's a whole set of them. The upper left one is the one that's most of interest to me. It was developed not as part of this exercise, but some 6-9 months earlier, and is actually the list of Dr. Robin Staffen, who's in the Basic Research Division of the Assistant Secretary of Defense's Research and Engineering Division. He had been asked, what are the technologies that are ripe for big advances that the department's not really doing enough of that could have a huge impact if pursued? And so these were his hot topics. And I'm here to tell you, to cut to the chase, that I like that list, and that's pretty much where we're going to end up. Slightly reordered, maybe a slight different emphasis or whatever. But it's interesting that this process that I'm about to undergo is merely confirmatory of a previous list that was developed in answer to a different question. You'll see some of the other technologies, some of which overlap with these, but a lot of the answers that people came back with were more sort of wish lists. Gosh, wouldn't it be nice to have this? They weren't technologies that were based upon some notion that, gosh, there's some idea that might lead to progress here. So, and they tend to be more capabilities, or at least some of them tend to be capabilities as opposed to technologies. The question you would ask about some of these things is, well, how am I going to do that? What technologies should underlie all of that? So, but having said all of that, now let's go through the process. And the emphasis in this talk, because that's what Michael Swetnam, our CEO, suggested, and he read a draft of this paper and liked very much, was the future operating environment, some thoughts and considerations about the future. And I take a large part of my text here, or my thesis, from the Joint Operating Environment 2010. Zach Lemnios and I enjoyed discussing and reading this document. Now, the Joint Operating Environment 2008, the lead author was our own Wick Murray from the Potomac Institute, head of our history and social science section. And in fact, he was the lead author for 2008 and was, in my estimation, slightly annoyed that he wasn't involved in the 2010 version. But if you read the 2010 version side by side with the 2008 version, you find out that it's basically word for word the same. So I think the powers that be liked the 2008 version so much they reissued it in 2010. Slightly different headings, better graphics. And there's a large number of discussions of sort of future trends and directions discussed. I'm going to focus on 3 of them, but incorporating some of the other thoughts. In any case, my discussion is largely based on this text, but supplementary with some research performed by Faith MacDonald here and myself. And some, it's always prognostication. So I'm going to focus on issues of globalization, economics, including competition for resources, and then competition for science and tech leadership. Yes, Charles?
In globalization, I would add the social media.
Yeah.
There's a new phenomenon whose import I'd hesitate to predict.
Dr. Hertzfeld is
real game changer.
Is a real good entry.
So I don't drop that. Don't forget about that.
Absolutely. And so just to emphasize your point, sort of a cartoon here. The thesis is the main thing in globalization. I mean, we've talked. People talk about outsourcing of jobs and new opportunities throughout the world, but the real point is that we've got a virtual proximity. People are much more in touch with other people, which Charles, I believe, sort of supports your thesis. It's not that Facebook is so important or Twitter or whatever. It's the underlying abilities to communicate, for people to change locations more easily because jobs are more mobile. Tourism, travel, people are much more in touch with one another. That's a trend that's been going on for hundreds of years, at least the last couple hundred years. But
it's speeded up. It's just like with commercial globalization, which is at least 500 years old.
Yeah.
It's now instantaneous, close to instead of 6 months on the rocket ship.
Exactly, exactly. So now you have, in close proximity, rich and poor people. Not that we didn't before, but there was sort of a separation by space. There could be a separation by dictators who said, you're in your place. Don't even look at how the other half lives. Of course, in terms of this trend over the last 100 years, so we all talk about the importance of Hollywood in communicating sort of a different view of life to the rest of the world. Of course, we could say, well, that's just the movies, it's not real. But now, now it's not just Hollywood, it's not just movies, it can be real life. We'll get into this. the main impact this could have on future conflicts is this disparity between people's expectations and what the world and society and jobs and the like actually fulfill. And that's basically the definition of depression, is when people have a view of, I would like this, and I can only have this. And that, I contend, could, I'll go way out on a limb. I'll ask it as a question. This could replace religion in terms of the motivator for conflicts of the future. Okay. Now, I like very much this chart, which comes from this guy Branko Mitanovic, who is is an economist for the World Bank. And he wrote a book entitled The Haves and Have-Nots. And he has many different charts of this sort. So let me explain the chart. It just takes a second or two to understand, but it's, I think, a very clever chart. So you take a given country, and you order all the people in that country according to their wealth. And you quantize into 20 bins, and you plot their wealth within that bin against the distribution of wealth in the entire world. Okay? So what this chart says, what this line says, is that in India, there are people that are close to 70% of in the 70th percentile in world wealth, which isn't bad, but there's a lot of very poor people as well. Okay? No big surprise there, but when you start looking at, oh, and by the way, this is all in purchasing power parity. So one argument would be, well, the U.S., the dollar is such that, but no, these have been normalized according to the fact that in India, one's ability to purchase things is far greater for given the official exchange rate than you would otherwise expect. So in purchasing power parity, what this thing says is that the U.S. is darn wealthy. By the way, the U.S. isn't the absolute top curve. There are countries that do better. I'd say the U.S. is probably the largest curve that is quite wealthy up here. So even the poorest people in the U.S., with probably a few minor exceptions, but when I say poorest, I mean in the bottom bin, the bottom 5%, are still 70% in the 70th percentile. They're doing better than most people in India. That's what this chart says. Yeah.
The percentage there is percentage of what?
So this is percentile. It's like if there's a normal distribution, 50% would be average. So so it's what percentile you're in relative to the rest of the world. Okay. So
the worldwide percentile plot.
That's right.
Based on the worldwide distribution.
Worldwide distribution of income is actually not wealth, but income. So,
hard to tie down, but you're right, it's very interesting. It would be fun to see how Japan looks.
Yeah, exactly. And he has exactly those charts in this book, and so I will simply allude to the book, which I haven't read in its entirety, but I think it's really fascinating and a very good way to analyze things. At the same time, so one thesis is there's great distributions in wealth, both within countries and across countries. This hardly needs discussion. We all know that communications are increasing rapidly. Let me just point out one thing here is smartphone sales are predicted to reach $500 million, more than $500 million, well, more than $500 million by 2014. That's sales. That says many more than 500 million people worldwide will have smartphones. Of course, smartphones only last a couple, 3 years, but still, a reasonable fraction of the world will have smartphones within the next few years. Maybe that doesn't surprise people, I don't know. I find it surprising, especially when you look at some of those curves of how poor the rest of the world is. So communications are really important. Yes, PK?
And it's worth noting, the United States does not lead in the application of smartphones. We're back in the fact that Russia, principal impediments are landlines and the infrastructure associated with our current way of doing business.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that has huge implications for the intelligence community.
Yeah, we need to place the intelligence community outside the U.S. I took this picture of downtown Manhattan. Actually, this is West Broadway. Near, I didn't take this picture. This picture comes off of the street maps in Google. Let me see, it's West Broadway and Spring Street. Back in my youth, I hung out at a bar right there. But
that explains a lot.
But the question I wanted to ask people looking at this image is, do you think any of these people were aware of the fact that their pictures were going to go on the internet? Or this guy who, if this thing is motorized, I wonder if it has a license, did they care? Look, if you live in Manhattan and, you know, there's no privacy and you can't expect privacy. By the way, Google, when driving around like this, doesn't just take pictures, they take LiDAR images. So behind all of this is three-dimensional information, which could, with sufficient resolution, it probably doesn't currently, but with sufficient resolution, you could perform biometrics to do person identification on these people.
That's a game changer candidate.
There you go. And oh, by the way, right now, Google updates these maps every few months. So
Not where I live. My Google Street View is 4 years old.
they trust you. They figure you're not up to anything.
I can tell when, because the only time a handyman parked his blue pickup truck on my driveway.
Yeah. But the notion of volunteer geographic information, or just volunteered information, says that in the future, Google might suggest that you volunteer your LiDAR and images so that they can track changes, say, hourly, or even in Manhattan, it might be every 10 minutes. So my point is, this future of communications and ubiquity of information is, we're just starting. We're just starting. So when we're looking at the future, you can basically assume, it seems to me, people are in proximity with other people, whether they're located in the same city, the same state, the same country, or in different hemispheres. Now, let's talk a little bit about economics. I mean, the change between globalization and economics is a fuzzy border here. So worldwide GDP and purchasing power parity is about $75 trillion at the moment. Even with the recession, it went down a touch. The world population right now is about 7 billion. There are different expectations for population increase, but far and away the most likely one, the sort of mid-level projection by United Nations and people who do this thing for a living, is that we will peak at around 9 billion or maybe 9.5 billion people later this century. And one of the reasons they believe that pretty firmly is that when you look at trends, we still see pretty large but somewhat declining growth rates in the poorer countries, but in OECD countries, we've actually started to see significant population declines in Europe, in Russia, predicted declines in Japan. The U.S. continues to increase in population. We're, around 310 million at the moment. 2030, there's a prediction will be 350 million. But immigration and an immigration bulge is partly driving that. So, and you know, there's debates about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'll tell you, Europe is certainly confronting all sorts of issues because of a declining population. And one of the main things, you know, I note the two phenomena here. One is there's lots of nations, poorer nations, where there's a huge youth bulge, simply because of the growth rates. But richer nations, where you see declining birth rates, you get a much larger elderly to worker ratio in the distribution. And this joint operating environment document has the standard charts that show the pyramids for various kinds of countries. But the U.S. is certainly going to have this kind of issue in the future, and of course this impacts on Social Security considerations, Medicare, Medicaid, and the like. This chart here, however, I want to sort of highlight because, you know, there's all this discussion about how, and it's true, that the GDP in purchasing power parity of China is pretty close to U.S. GDP in PPP at this point in time, and is predicted to pass one another in 2014. So everybody says, well, so China's so rich. But you got to remember they have 5 times as many people as we do. So if you start plotting GDP in PPP per capita, now the interesting thing is the U.S. isn't tops. There are plenty of other countries that are doing better: Abu Dhabi, UAE, Norway, and then there's plenty of European countries. Germany's right up there. Greece, which, if you read the news, is this basket case, right? Can't do a thing right, you know, their economies. They're not that bad. I mean, by European standards, they're way down there. But it ain't nothing compared to Afghanistan, right? I mean, GDP, PPP per person in Afghanistan is $900 a year. China is way down here. They're actually a little below world average. Now, within any given country, including China, there's huge variations. Same's true in the U.S. Yes, sir.
How to say this quickly and succinctly? The data used in GDP and TPP do not include the natural resource values of the nation. And a move is afoot in the United States, at least, to make GDP recognize the value of natural resources.
Yeah, yeah.
It can be argued, and has been argued by some people, that the declines we see represented in U.S. position worldwide are in some cases resulting from our decline in the abundance of and value of natural resources.
I will get to oil in just a second, which is a huge part of it.
Beyond oil.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think it's a really critical point. It needs to be expanded another smidge.
Yep.
GDP is a cash transaction measurement.
That's right.
It's not a net value calculation.
Nor is it net income, by the way.
Nor net income. But hear me out. There's
Yeah.
one more line to this. Nobody knows what the balance sheet for any country looks like. I know of only 2 attempts, and Britain was one, where they tried to estimate what's the asset value, and it's a good expression. And they found there was about 7 times their GDP at that time.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's probably not a characteristic ratio, but it's an interesting one. And all of the discussions about economy and what debt can you incur and so on is nonsense, because whether you can borrow to buy a house depends on your net value, not just on your income.
Yeah, yeah.
And so whether our debt is too high with our GDP, very difficult to answer it. I think few people have really thought about that. Oh, wonderful.
Excuse me.
May I have your
Fire
attention,
drills
please?
going
May I have your
on.
attention,
Yes,
please?
sir.
Just a simple explanation. We will be testing the fire alarm
It's a
system,
passport.
so please disregard all audible devices.
We will be glad to disregard. Yes, answer and then
It's
Mike.
just simple explanation. We will be testing
And
the
the
fire alarm.
ability to purchase
So please
that house
disregard all audible and
depends
visual
upon whether
devices
the
for
house
further
is
notice.
stick-built,
Thank you.
Yeah.
built out of wood, built
Sure.
out of steel,
Yeah.
fake 2x4s, or whatever. China did in fact attempt at one point, just a very few years ago, to incorporate natural resource values because of their large amounts of coal they have. When the people in charge of policy saw what was happening, the effort ceased. At least the visible part of the effort ceased.
Yeah.
Just not
Yeah, very good. Paul, if you want to.
There's an effort under the OECD Working Group on Modern Societies to redo all this stuff.
Right.
This is widespread, it's recognized, it's old.
I would agree that so when we've had economists here, when we've talked to economists, some of these standard measures, even the purchasing power parity, it's a gross oversimplification. And but all of this discussion is sort of feeding into the hypothesis, which is that it is the communication and the visual display and the interaction of people that will let them understand the disparities. It's not the statistics, it's not the, in fact, what you're arguing here is that these statistics can be very misleading. And that actually is, I would say, whoops, that's part of my point here about this China statistic, is that in the popular press and in people's perception, China is just the exciting place to be right now. Whether it's true or not, I'm not qualified to say.
You will agree.
Yeah, yeah. Whereas,
Incursorily.
yeah. Whereas these statistics would tell you, no, it's a poor country. People aren't, if anything, they are desperate to catch up.
There's more to China than Beijing and Shanghai, especially population-wise.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah, and I did say it's great.
But the income distribution, it seems like seeing how it has changed.
Yeah. Very good. Okay, so let me move on because it leads to competition for resources issues. And as I say, the good news, I mean, despite the recession and poverty and all of that, the world's producing plenty enough food to feed everyone. Of course, try and tell people in Kenya and Somalia that. So there are issues of major issues of distribution. The bad news, though, is that, and again, this concept of GDP not necessarily being really what wealth is. People feel wealthy when energy is cheap. And so the price of energy has a lot to do with one's perception of equality and fairness. And there are, depending upon how you look at it, and I'll have one chart, there are likely shortage of energy resources in the future, and plenty of people are hedging bets, including the Chinese. What I wanted to emphasize, I think it really gets down to national security policy. Do we want to help others meet their resource needs?
The fire alarm system in the building?
Or do we want to make sure that domestically we have enough resources to keep our populace happy? And there are arguments pro and con both ways. And I claim, political divides within this country can happen over these. Because the former can reduce conflicts, can reduce your need for warfare, for significant defense. The latter, though, is sort of the expedient, hey, we're in this together, we formed a union, we need to work together. So this chart here, which comes from, it's in essence a lobbying group called the Oil Drum. Their thesis is peak oil. So there are different projections of what's going to happen to worldwide energy. And in fairness to them, they plot different projections. Now, they're here to tell you they think it's the lower curve. They think we've pretty much hit the peak production of oil at, by the way, around, it's a misleading chart. This is 65. This isn't 0 down here. So we've pretty much hit the bottom, the top at around 82, 83 millions of barrels of oil per day. But other projections say there's lots and lots of oil still available. There's certainly lots of natural gas available, and hydraulic fracturing, which is somewhat controversial at this point, but certainly holds the promise for greatly increasing petroleum resources. Yes,
May I
Peter?
have your attention, please?
Just yell
May
it
I have
out.
your attention, please?
There has been a fire emergency reported in the building. Please leave the building by the
Yeah.
nearest exit or exit stairway. Do not use the
Yeah,
elevator.
yeah. We've all, the older you are, the more skeptical you are of the lower curve, on account of the fact we've heard it
There
all
has been a
before.
fire emergency
Absolutely.
reported in the building. Please leave
It's
the building
good.
by the nearest
But,
exit
you
or
know,
exit
to my
stairway.
10-year-old
Do
daughter,
not
that's
use the
not a
elevator.
very convincing argument. So, that's right. Likewise, price of oil, oil projections are all over the place. So, you know, the takeaway I take from this is uncertainty, current uncertainty in energy resources and availability.
There has been a fire emergency reported in the
And,
building.
you know, there's
Please
some
leave the
technology
building by the nearest exit or exit stairway. Do not
solutions
use the
to all of
elevator.
this. And yeah, there's work in all of these areas, including, by the way, cleaner use of coal, which,
There has been a fire
frankly,
emergency
I
reported in the
think that's the
building.
most likely
Please leave the building
direction.
by the nearest exit or exit
Especially
stairway.
because of
Do
China's
not use the
desire
elevator.
for added energy resources. Yes? I'll repeat, yeah.
There's also becoming more efficient about using the energy you have. For example, the internal combustion engine is by no means the
Yeah.
most efficient.
May I have your
it could
attention,
be.
please?
And we've just
May I
ignored
have your
that.
attention,
Yeah,
please?
that's absolutely true. The efficiency of use of all resources matters a great deal. Having said all that, and I don't think I do have it here, these estimates of the likely
May I
additional
have your attention?
energy use,
There has been a fire
those have been
emergency
pretty
reported in the
accurate
building.
historically,
Please leave the building by the
regardless of
nearest exit or exit
recessions,
stairway. Do not use the
conservation,
elevator.
all sorts of impacts. The net result is people catch up soon thereafter, and not necessarily through inefficiencies, but by finding other uses, by when the cost of jet fuel goes down, people travel more.
May I have your attention?
So
please?
you tend
May I have
to
your
use more.
attention, please?
Charles,
There
you're
has been a fire
skeptical.
emergency reported in the building. Please leave the building by the nearest exit or exit stairway. Do not use the
The
elevator.
perceptions of people are often
May I have
wrong.
your attention,
Yeah.
please?
Paul said correctly,
May I have
this is
your
old
attention,
news
please?
about something.
There has been a fire emergency reported in the building.
Absolutely.
Please leave the building by the nearest exit or exit stairway. Do not use the
bad
elevator.
information dominates the public discourse. It's a game changer, by the way.
In the next version of this, I will include a chart that shows the exponential growth in energy use, which, as I say, has just been unflinching.
Now, I want to
May I
add,
have your attention,
the
please?
focus of,
May I have your
The
we
attention,
talk about the
please?
economy, about
There has
growth
been
of
a
the
fire
economy.
emergency
Rather
reported in the
than
building. Please leave the
volume.
building by the nearest exit or exit
Then volume, the
stairway. Do not use the elevator.
volume of
Yeah, yeah.
economic activity. Gross
May I
misleading.
have your attention, please?
Nations
May I have your
develop for hundreds of
attention,
years
please?
in 1%.
There has been a fire
Yeah,
emergency
yeah.
reported in the building. Please leave the building by the nearest exit or exit stairway. Do not use the elevator.
Yeah, yeah.
Confusing ourselves.
Let me just add a footnote to that. The United States government does not publish wealth statistics. It stopped in the early 80s. The numbers were
May I have your
bogus.
attention,
It has
please?
not continued to be
May I have
so.
your
Michael
attention,
Boskin
please?
tried to get
There has been a fire
$2 million
emergency reported in the building.
redo all
Please
these
leave the building by the nearest exit
precisely
or
because
exit
of the
stairway.
recognition that
Do
it's
not
not
use
net
the
national
elevator.
income devalued, depreciated
May I
by
have
some
your
discounted
attention,
rate
please?
that reflects all
May I
this.
have your attention,
Nobody
please?
would put up the money
There
because
has been a fire
they don't
emergency
want to.
reported in the building.
So
Please
what
leave
this
the
is
building by the nearest exit or
leading
exit
to
stairway.
is sort
Do
of
not
the
use
notion
the
that
elevator.
when there are, when the curves, when the demand versus production curve cross, and suddenly natural gas prices spike, for instance, people act surprised. I had no idea.
May I have
Or when
your
there are
attention,
suddenly
please?
water shortages,
May I
when
have
you
your
turn on the
attention,
tap
please?
and water doesn't come
There
out
has
in
been
the
a fire
southwest of the
emergency
U.S.
reported in the
Did I have the
building.
water
Please
shortage
leave the
chart there?
building by
Yeah.
the nearest
Yeah.
exit or exit stairway.
You know, so maybe in sub-Saharan Africa, they won't be surprised, but in southwest U.S., you know, you hear about water, but people expect that, gosh, there must be plenty of water for me. So when shortages actually show up, when there's economic changes, people will be surprised, and that can lead to conflicts. Finally, science and technology. This is the one I would most like to dwell on, but I'm basically going to skip over because we all know it. There's plenty of people publishing, bemoaning, oh, the U.S. is losing in technology leadership. The truth of the matter is, U.S. research and development investments are still 1/3 of the world.
There has been a fire emergency.
But that's only 1/3. That's one point. Okay, Paul wants to. I'll let Paul.
So we just went from talking about the importance of purchasing power parity for GDP.
Yeah.
There is no equivalent purchasing power parity for R&D, S&T anywhere in the world.
Okay, very good.
That's the number of papers published per year.
Yeah.
And that's a
May I have
good
your
measure,
attention,
which is not
please?
too bad.
Approved.
May I have your
Yeah.
attention,
Better than
please?
nothing.
There has been a fire emergency reported in the building. Please leave the building by the nearest
I have a
exit or exit
suggestion about how
stairway.
to counter this.
Do not
Yes.
use the elevator.
Earphones for everyone.
For
Microphones.
microphones,
May I have
that's
your
right.
attention, please?
The people on the people who are watching this by webcast have a certain advantage at this point. They
Please
can
leave
hear
the
me
building by the nearest
more
exit or
clearly.
exit stairway. Do not use the elevator.
It's just an accident of one time. Okay, I take Paul's point that our estimates of total funding in research and development, which, by the way, development covers a great deal of sins.
May I have your attention,
We
please?
say science and technology is sort of basic research, slightly more advanced research, and prototyping, but isn't development of product necessarily. Anyway, lots of publications. The one I most recommend is Rising Above the Gathering Storm Revisited, Norm Augustine. Shelton has this paper on measuring the decline in U.S. science leadership. You could look at sort of growth rates of different kinds of funding or lack of growth in different kinds of funding in DoD science and technology. That was of particular interest to my client. But
May I have your attention, please?
I think a more
There has
interesting
been a
one
fire
is
emergency
percentage.
reported in the
This is of
building.
the total.
Please leave the building by the nearest exit or exit stairway.
People that are measured
Do not use
differently.
the elevator.
This is an
yeah.
ever-shrinking fraction.
May I have your
of the
attention,
national
please?
output.
Yeah,
And
May I have your
therefore
attention,
elaborate
please?
that's right.
the
There
DoD
has been a
program
fire
on
emergency
other
reported in the
Government-
building. Please leave
That's
the
right.
building
In
by the
government
nearest exit
funding
or
of
exit
R&D
stairway.
within the
Do not
U.S.,
use the
government
elevator.
is, I think, around 40% now. The rest is mostly industrial. Although, by the way, universities, a fair bit of research is funded by tuition dollars. Right? I mean, faculty member gets a salary, it's mostly coming from tuition that the kids are paying, and the faculty member is expected to do some
It's
research.
in New York City.
There has been a fire emergency reported
Oh,
in the
just where I was.
Please leave the building by the nearest exit or exit stairway.
Okay,
Do
so
not
what
use the
sort of
elevator.
national security challenges do we expect?
May I have your
And
attention,
I'm not
please?
going to go into great
May I
detail
have
here.
your
The main
attention,
point of this talk was that
There is a
environment
fire
point, but
emergency
to sort
reported in the
of
building.
finish the
Please
story,
leave the building by
there's
the nearest exit or exit
regional
stairway.
conflicts.
Do
We
not
did them
use
into
the
sort of
elevator.
three groups here. Regional conflicts, empowered insurgencies, including terrorism, and then two different forms of peer competitors, alternate superpowers. And the main one we always think about is China. But there are other possibilities that can involve consortia, for instance, of Asian countries. Well, I'll expand just slightly
Please leave the
when I
building by
get
the
there.
nearest exit or exit stairway. Do not use the
I'm sorry.
elevator.
Regional conflicts.
May I have your attention, please?
I'll just cut to the chase, something that Secretary Gates said recently in a talk that he gave while he was still secretary, actually. Our record of predicting where we will use military force ever since Vietnam is perfect. We've never gotten it right. So, and not even 6 months in advance. So here are various flashpoints. I'll leave you the geometry quiz of connecting the geographic quiz, I mean, of connecting the dots to the locales. All of these are mentioned and some are discussed in that joint operating environment document. The point is that there's a lot of possibilities, and then there's even some surprise ones. I guess the most surprising one, when I was querying various people, they suggested, well, there could be a huge conflict between the Free State of Arizona and the independent Southern California regime, so over water disputes.
In the spirit of not being able to predict in advance, I don't think I see anything there regarding Arctic conflict.
Oh, very good point. We had it in our list, Arctic conflicts. You don't have a dot up in the Arctic.
Down,
Now that's about resources.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
that's
that's the
true.
list.
Yep, very fair. Yeah, it was on the list at some point. I'll
Like the
take
whole
it.
world is in one big star, the whole world, so it counts.
Okay. But the security conflicts, you got to ask, what's the U.S. Interest? And we will have interest in some of these conflicts. We've already seen that. So Libya was sort of a surprise and yet shouldn't have been. But Libya really fits this whole thesis of the Arab Spring, people seeing how other people live and fed up with their puppet dictator or whatever. Anyway, a lot of these regional conflicts, just like we had in Libya, well, we still need missiles, we still need aircraft, we still need surveillance assets. So incremental improvements on I say incremental, they could be large improvements that are needed in order to be able to conduct operations. But you know, what's true right now will continue to be true, is that we have more missiles, we have better missiles, we have better aircraft. In Libya, we had a talk here where it was pointed out that the Osprey, the V-22, which we've heard so much negative comments about over decades, performed very well. So, yeah.
Libya was instructed another way. Our allies, just like we did 30 years ago, didn't buy enough precision weapons. So they ran out after 2 days of work.
Yeah.
They had to stand down.
Yeah.
And this is the same. It was the same dynamic we had with the U.S. when the inventory of precision weapons was like 2%, and some of us in this room were screening up and down Constitution Avenue with very little effect. But it's very different now.
Yeah. So, you see, in the spirit of this sort of analysis, what you would say then is what we need is either more focus on stockpiling, but if you ask the question, what are the right technologies, well, it would be rapid manufacturing, rapid acquisition capabilities, better anticipation of these sorts of events. PK.
And this goes back to Charles' point about, so let's say for the sake of the argument that we had all the U.S. inventory was 100% precision guidance. What value is it if you take them all, as we did in Germany, and store them all in one place that would be trivial to destroy?
Yes.
It's an irrelevant comparison. If you're doing side-by-side comparisons, why bother? Really? I mean, it's head-to-head. I was here for the Osprey lessons learned. They did that operation in spite of the fact that they had no near real-time ISO.
Yep.
Okay? So doing these kinds of rack and stacks, what's the point?
So, just to be provocative,
Yeah.
What I'm hearing is, in a regional conflict, we're the big boys, we have all the missiles, we have all the toys, et cetera, we don't have to improve a whole lot. But that presupposes our ability to afford in the future to maintain that capability. So you, I think, have a tacit assumption of what the national environment is going to be.
I guess I didn't read, but you've gotten ahead of me. I said, here are the challenges, which I think answers partly PK's concern. I mean, certainly data and knowledge management, understanding and simulating the information. Part of what I'm doing is racking and stacking at this point the novel capabilities. I mean, the first bullet says, yes, this is largely about improving our current capabilities. The second bullet says, well, there's a set of possible things that technology could help drive. And certainly, you know, where we're going to come out is intelligence is a big one, ISR is a big one, fast acquisition is a big one. Okay.
Well, let me read Fred's thought. So, Fred, you think that the Navy would agree that they're dominant in transiting the Straits of Hormuz in the presence of the state-of-the-art mines that exist?
No.
They'll just tell you wrong colored water.
Okay. The wonderful thing about this discussion, PK, that you sort of brought up in terms of, well, do we stockpile or do we, is that at this point with resource limitations, and that's where this question sort of came up with, is science and technology development is now at conflict with acquisition and improving. And one of the arguments I would like to make, I mean, it's an argument, it's not necessarily being bought, but is that given that there's going to be budget declines, and therefore we're almost certain to be buying less stuff in the next 5 to 10 years, what you need to do is, in fact, invest in these new kinds of challenges to a much greater extent, so that when you do confront national security challenges 10, 20 years hence, and hopefully are able to afford to respond, you can respond in the most efficient and up-to-date manner, as opposed to being stymied by antiquated capabilities and material.
This competition for resources is old news, my friend. And at least two of us here representing organizations that were almost wiped out by the mass buyers, ONR and DARPA, who were in constant threat of being eaten by some weapon system that ran off.
We all remember the peace dividend.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the peace dividend was devastating. Okay, let me, then the empowered insurgencies, the kinds of there's a whole big discussion. Tawfiq Hamid is better at speaking about this than myself. But once again, you come down to the big challenges, and we all know this, is intelligence and surveillance, information. Influence ops becomes a big potential driver in the future. We're not very good at it, and we need to get better, and it's a technology issue.
One thing that bothers me is you can extract information. In fact, I would argue that we extract enormous amounts of information.
Yeah.
But it's not always usable.
Yeah.
And so you need to take it further than just information.
They always say actionable intelligence and actionable
or
information.
cognition or some, you can argue the words infinitesimally, but information in itself we have tons of.
Yep.
It's getting it to the right decision person.
And by the way, you know, part of when all of this is said and done, you start racking the capability needs. And I'm going to cut to this rather than looking at all of the security challenges. You start putting down, here are kind of capability, exactly. And these, there's a self-serving thing here where the Assistant Secretary for Defense and Engineering, for Research and Engineering, has a list of 7 priorities, right? And one is data to decisions, and another is WMD detection. In some sense, this list is confirmatory, and there was a little bit of cheating here, forethought, that, wow, this is where we were aiming. So, you know, the real lesson of this whole discussion is this process that we laid out actually a viable or valuable or proper one? And so anyway, if you come up with these kinds of capability needs, then as we said before, these are the kinds of sciences that, and again, I haven't created a matrix, but we did this in our own minds, that these kinds of sciences feed into those kinds of capabilities. And I'll just, those are the staff in 6. But I will simply flip through sort of my reordering or restructuring of those 6 that came about as a result of this process. But there's sort of a surprise at the end. So neurobiology, neuromodeling, brain-machine interfaces. Professor Giordano is in the back of the room here. And again, he could speak to the state of affairs in this field far better than I. And by the way, something I would very much like to do, Jim and I have sort of discussed these thoughts, is for each of these topics that I'm going to flip through right now, I think it deserves at least an hour-long discussion and bringing in some experts and talking about the true state of affairs and what are the possibilities and what the priorities should be. Nanotechnology I've bundled together with materials science. You know, it's not new that material science is very important. What's sort of new is that there are a new set of techniques, in particular nanobiotechnology. I've also heard it phrased bio-nanotechnology. Among other things, nanotechnology offers possibilities for making far better batteries, because one of the things that limits batteries is degradations of the materials on the anode and or cathode within the battery. And so that there are ways of manufacturing and engineering the materials at the nanoscale that could potentially inhibit the formation of structures within the battery that defeat its purpose. Yeah?
Just an example. First question. Do you have a list of capabilities we don't need?
We should try.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, yes.
Second, on materials, let me go back. There is nothing improvised about explosively formed projectiles.
Mm-hmm.
The countermeasures to that in the hardwire program required all new math, all new software, all new manufacturing processes that did not exist 5 years ago, and that was all new material.
You're bringing up a wonderful point that actually Charles and I have discussed at a much earlier time, which is that in my list here, there are not included such things as mathematics, which is near and dear to my heart. And you can go back to mathematics in the mid-19th century and discover things that, you know, Riemann surfaces that led to general relativity, which leads to nuclear weapons, which was definitely a game changer. But the time scale is on the order of 100 years.
Let me, again, just because it's being broadcast, this was one of the first applications of topology to the design of materials for purposes of countermeasures.
The EFPs.
Yes.
Yeah, explosively formed projectiles.
The counters to the EFPs in the hardwire program, which is why Leo got American Material Sciences to do.
Yeah.
So this notion that S&T is out there, has no contribution to the current fight, that's just a lot of bullshit.
I think it's an important point, because Vannevar Bush, and I have that quote here somewhere, said, you know, basic research needs to progress without thought of applications. And so I like that thought, but what you're saying is, given that the question was, what are the technology drivers in the next 10 to 20 years, that's what people want, that's what they're willing to fund, we need to shorten that loop such that the mathematics that we do isn't adulterated by or reprioritized by the particular capabilities, but that it lets you achieve certain capabilities at a far greater speed than we have heretofore. And I would claim that the commercial market is in a process of doing that sort of thing, but that DoD much as we bellyache about how we need to bring capabilities to fruition faster, and it's one of Zach Limnios's imperatives, accelerating the acquisition of capabilities. We're not making much progress in that direction. Okay, quantum technologies deserves a whole day of study. Information analysis, the exploitation of the ubiquity of information, exactly as Dr. Salfield suggested. Autonomous systems gets us far too close to AI all over again. And just like energy futures predictions, everybody's saying AI, well, we've tried that before. But I'm here to tell you, and I'll go to my grave, that there have been some big, there's been a lot of progress made, and that there's some ideas, especially in the area of learning, that can lead to mimicking cognitive behavior in special kinds of architectures, which might well include quantum computing architectures. And I know I'm spouting nonsense to a body of the scientific community, but that's what I believe. And it deserves a lot more discussion by people who are in the know. And then I'm going to, so I'll end with this, is virtual design and advanced manufacturing. And in fact, I was talking to someone at Amazon.com in sales. They're hoping for a 10-fold increase in their sales of cloud computing to the U.S. government over the next few months. And so why? Why would the government want? Well, there's all this supercomputer stuff, and it's a 10-fold decrease in the price of supercomputing when you go to the cloud. But here's my thesis of where supercomputing is really going to be needed. And that is in virtual design of things. Right now, people prototype, they make things, they test them, they then do modifications, risk reduction. It takes a long time, and it's largely based upon engineering practice and prototyping and test and evaluations.
I'm sorry, the way that I agree with what you say.
Yeah.
I think the problem is a cultural problem. And the important memory, engineers like to build something that's the wrong size. They really do enjoy that, otherwise they behave differently. But there are counterexamples. The 777 was designed without a physical prototype.
Yeah.
The 787, which has other problems, likewise.
Yeah.
The latest aircraft carrier, apparently, likewise.
Yeah.
So there is a revolution going on, but like all revolutions, they're not aided from above and below. It's very slow.
And you're in exactly, I mean, exactly, you're speaking to the choir here, that's exactly the sort of revolution that I don't think has really occurred yet, but it's about to occur.
But could be pushed along.
And what is missing in the 777 design, for instance, yes, they use CATIA, they use Dassault Systems, spectacularly good modeling software. And CATIA, we had them, or actually Dassault, we had them in this room just a few days ago. So they're very interested. They have research on transforming their work from simple physical modeling to being able to put those models in context and doing analysis. But you also need to mix the models from, say, physical kinetics with electronics, with materials, with heat dissipation, so that you can do virtual testing and accelerate the design and prototyping phases, so that whereas now it can take years to develop a defense system, a new aircraft, you want to be able to accelerate that to months or even weeks. Yeah.
The world leader in this now in the field is mathematical. You have a smartphone and $2 is all you need. You can go, you just download the app, Wolfram Alpha, and what's going on in the back room is they've just acquired the leading German engineering and design firm in the area of virtual prototypes.
Yeah.
And the service they're going to be offering is you hand sketch, hand draw, whatever it is you think you want to produce. You send it in through your smartphone, and they'll tell you whether or not it's producible and what the problems are.
So I
They'll
think-
all the physics checks, all the chemistry checks, all the electronics checks. $2.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've been intrigued with 3D printing is, does that lead to parts on demand, for example, that you can put on an aircraft
Yeah.
carrier? Forget all the logistics.
Exactly.
Just
The
just
answer is right
push
now,
that.
no. Right
No,
now,
I
no.
know it's not now, but that could be
But why
pushed
not?
and make a huge difference in logistics.
Absolutely, and doesn't it say that here? It says, you're absolutely right. No, but that's the thought. And in some sense, this is prognostication more than it is appeal. I think this will come, whether it's 10 years or 20 years. I think this is the natural progression. But I think for the logistics point, for the acceleration of design and acquisition, DoD should be getting into this business with alacrity, yeah.
You brought up a really interesting point that actually merges 2 or 3 of the vectors that you have on the screen. One of the areas of autopoietic devices that sort of goes away from the artificial intelligence that then create machine sentience
Yeah.
is the ability to then engage cloud-based computing to be able to become functionally autopoietic and then have what's called a formulating device. So what these things can then do is they can create a large enough operational neural network database to then actually link into a mathematical type program. The main types of programs that do this are being done at the University of Tübingen in Germany, which then creates a fabricating prototype
Yeah.
that the device can then literally request the parts for and become fully autopoietic.
Yeah, yeah.
So it has these sort of strange Terminator rise of the machines type scenarios. However, what it does create is self-sustaining physically intelligent machines.
So let me say, you can go buy a 3D printer right now. They're like 10, 15,000 bucks, but there's even cheaper, simpler ones. They use plastic, and there's a polymer, and they assemble these things. So there's this neat video of who is it? Jay Leno, who's a auto enthusiast, and he takes a broken part, he glues it back together, you scan it in real time, you get a 3D representation, you print it out, and there is a version of the auto part that they can then cast and make a replacement part for a 1910 something or another. So it's the logistics issue. The fact that these things are, it's basically the same technology as your laser printer, but working in 3D. And, or actually, I should say your inkjet printer. But, yeah.
Let me raise a point. So the first military application of a wearable computer was done by Dick Urban at DARPA, wearing a 386 with an eyepiece, done for marine logistics, so that you could take the equivalent of the Chilton's Auto Manual, store them on there, and have the maintenance guys, in effect, wear their manuals and not have to come out from under the rail.
Yeah.
We got no credit for that. And that's a failure of the incentive structure inside the Department of Defense. There's no benefit accrued to doing anything for the rest of anything outside of the acquisition system and improving it.
Yeah. So the conclusion is, well, did this game plan work? So I guess I think the jury is very much out. I'm not sure I like it. I like better, as we said at the start, just saying, here are the technologies that look to me like they're going to make a difference, that are right for. But I will say part of what the game plan did was a number of findings, some of which we elucidated, are not up here, that we elucidated in our discussion, which is that, so there's this point about applications versus technologies. There's this point about how far in the future are you looking. There's the acceleration of the transition. PK is bringing up another issue, which is the pull, the incentives for investments. And basically, it goes back to our worldview, but the economics of funding research, of funding technology development, are kind of strange. And that was my point about university research. You know, we were speaking of GDP. Research doesn't count in GDP. My salary is not part of GDP because I'm VP for research. So, in fact, intermediate products, microprocessors and chips and boards, they're not part of GDP. GDP is the sum of all of the end products, the consumer purchasables, or capital equipment as well.
I have a serious suggestion for adding to the game plan chart. I would try, and it may need 2 or 3 more steps in the process description. I would try and identify what are the scientific/technical problems, what are cultural problems, including incentives, what are organizational problems, because you don't have the right organizational structure to do what you want to do. Like some of these steps that you are advocating, I think are not primarily technical problems, they're primarily cultural or organizational.
In Zach Lemnios's mind, and I discussed more or less that with him, they're down here at the bottom. He was thinking those sorts of considerations are his and management and follow this process. But I think, I hear you sort of saying that you need to modulate this process with an understanding of some of the impediments and difficulties and cultural issues. And I think that's a very valid point.
I spend too much time of my life trying to chase some of these down. And it's very hard to grab them.
Yeah.
And some are blindingly obvious, but very hard to change.
I should point out to those who don't know, but Charles Hertzfeld has occupied the same position and others, but I keep mentioning the Honorable Zach Lemnios. It's also the Honorable Dr. Charles Hertzfeld. He occupied the same position at some point. Jerry first.
So variation on a theme, if I was king for a day, what you've basically done is say, here's a view of the future, and here are the technologies I need to prepare for that future. You've also said that Secretary Gates says we can't predict 6 months out.
Yeah.
So modifications in methodology does not say here is the future operating environment, but here are the family of environments that we might envision, and then look for the common capability needs and the common technologies to enable that, keep you from walking down a single path.
I think that's right, but, and maybe I went too fast, but that was this notion of binning future conflict types into those 3 kinds of bins. And I did sort of gloss over that, but that was intentional because this was mostly a discussion about that future environment. But I think you're right. I mean, looking at a range of alternate futures is absolutely essential to justifying the capability developments. Yeah.
Well, I want to nail Charles' point down by giving, and the one you just raised, by giving a real example, quantum dots. I was just treated to a National Academy of Science presentation in which I was assured by one of the world's leading researchers that quantum dots have never been used on humans. To which I said, how do you know? And the answer is, he didn't. Now, the reason this is so important is because it is a fiction that the research community is omniscient with respect to what's going on in its areas of work. The reason quantum dots are so important, this is the first time you're going to have a capability to read out of what's going on inside a cell. There are lots of reasons for doing those sorts of experiments. Unfortunately, one of the biggest impediments is the FDA, okay, and the IRBs associated with that. So if you're looking for game changers, the way is the first thing to jettison is the hubris that says we know everything that's going on everywhere in the world.
Yep. Go back to the intelligence concerns. Well, thank you all very much for a very enlightening discussion. To everyone, including those on the web, I encourage or I solicit your comments, suggestions, observations by email, rhummel@PotomacInstitute.org. It's Hummel, Hummel. Thanks to Faith MacDonald. She was quiet here, but she was very instrumental in pulling a lot of this together. So thanks as well. Thank you all. Oh, and there's some pizza left for those who aren't on the web. I'm sure.